Sourit Bhattacharya will be speaking on catastrophic realities and humanities studies. To introduce Sourit Bhattacharya, Professor Sourit Bhattacharya is lecturer in post-colonial studies at the University of Glasgow. His research interests include post-colonial literatures, eco-criticism, translation studies, and Marxism and literary form. His works in these areas are either published or forthcoming in such journals as Ariel, Textual Practice, Interventions, Irish University Review, and edited books such as Cambridge Critical Concepts, Magic Realism, The Aesthetics and Politics of Global Hunger, and others. His first monograph, titled Post-Colonial Modernity and the Indian Novel on Catastrophic Realism, was published in June 2020. Sourit is also a founding editor, co-editor, along with Professor Orko Chattopadhyay, who is also one of our plenary in, tomorrow, of the journal Songlap, Journal of Literary and Cultural Studies. Professor Sourit and Professor Sourit's forthcoming book on Nabarun Bhattacharya is also coming from Bloomsbury, which is also a co-edited volume worked in collaboration with from Somnath Sengupta and Orko Chattopadhyay. Also promises to be an important one because it is one of the first book to introduce Nabarun Bhattacharya to the international academia. Congratulations for this important endeavor. I hand over now to Professor Sourit. Yeah, you can start.
Okay, just before I start, am I audible?
Yeah, clearly.
Okay, and the other thing is, can you see a slide if I share? Can you see that?
Entirely visible. Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, all right. So just wanted to make sure that these things are visible, etc. So thank you so much, first of all, to Dr. Paramita Chakraborty and to sorry, is it right? I'm just making sure that my screen is all right with you as well. Just yes. So thank you so much, Dr. Paramita Mukherjee and Dr. Shubro Shahab, who is probably going to be doctor soon. So thank you so much for inviting me to your conference and at the plenary. Something on an issue that is something that needs a lot of discussions and debates, especially humanities, especially how we see humanities in the current times, especially when globally we're facing a challenging issue. And although we need to remember that disproportionately challenging, not to all of us, it is challenging in the same manner. So this is something that I was thinking about, and today's talk is about what is actually humanities doing, or humanities can do, or probably is already doing, that we are not always getting to have sort of attending to. So just to make sure that some of the quotes that I have taken, mostly from the from the public, things that are already available online, so that we are all on the same page. So just to start with humanities and humanities in crisis, something that Professor Aki Mukherjee was already pointing out, something that I feel we need to once again remember, like what exactly is the question of crisis, and why is it that humanities we speak about are in crisis, and what does the word humanities and crisis, what do these words actually mean in this context? So humanities, Cambridge English Dictionary says, is literature, language, history, philosophy, and other subjects that are not a science or the study of these subjects. It is, as you understand, a kind of a cryptic definition when you think about some things which are like, it's not very clear exactly. This is done through elimination, things that are not science. What is science? So, I mean, if somebody does linguistics or language studies, is it science? So this is a very abstract or sort of a misleading definition to me. Not in the same way that in the same way that we understand humanities. Humanities tend to mean a lot. Sometimes it means scientific studies of language, literature, etc. Sometimes it means just interpretation. Sometimes it might just mean having the capacity to to rationalize, to debate, or even to not rationalize. So humanities have come to mean a lot of things, and this is precisely where I believe the challenges begin as to what exactly to me has led to the question of crisis. So this is I'd like rather like a definition that another noted scholar, Marjorie Perloff, Crisis in the Humanities, she writes, and this is something that she takes from the National Endowment of Humanities from the US, where the definition, and I'm quoting Marjorie Perloff's blog and article that she wrote, Crisis in the Humanities, where she says, and I'm apologizing if the font is too small for you, that's what I'm also reading out, the humanities are not any one thing. And this is NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities. They are all around us and evidently in our daily lives. When you visit an exhibition on the many realms of King Arthur at your local library, that is the humanities. When you read the diary of a 17th century New England midwife, that is the humanities. When you watch an episode of the Civil War, that is the humanities too, unquote. Now, again, the definition to me is that when you visit an exhibition, go to a library, and watch a particular like a play or series, these are humanities. It seems to me that this definition once again misleads us as to humanities is something that have already been done, or that are things that are mostly to do with entertainment and mostly to do with leisure, or let's say pleasure. And this is something that is kind of an argument that Perloff sort of maintains in her piece, and I'm quoting her again from her piece, that the neo-Puritan notion that literature and other arts must be somehow useful, and only useful, that the Ciceronian triad, docere, movere, delectere, should renounce its third element, delight, and even the original meaning of its second element, so that to move means only to move readers to some kind of virtuous action, has produced a climate in which it has become increasingly difficult to justify the study of English or comparative literature. This is something that comes as a response to Robert Weisbuch, and Professor Mukherjee was also pointing to this sort of a situation in the 80s and 90s, especially later on as well, that humanity is in crisis precisely because things that we are teaching do not make any sense. Things that we are teaching are things of the past. Things that we are teaching are not being able to persuade a student population to come and study humanities with us. Rather, they're moving towards science. And there are plenty of articles and essays, etc., and books as well in the academic sector that talk about these sort of aspects, these sort of changes, the change to how like English literature or sort of humanities have really fallen behind to sort of persuade a student population to come and sort of take a study with a university, spending thousands and hundreds and thousands of dollars, of pounds and rupees, etc., on a humanities program that might not fetch them their job. So that's the usefulness. Whether humanities are useful and can fetch you a job has been a kind of a study and a critique, that whether humanity is in crisis, whether the solution is to not think of it as something that will fetch you a job or is something that is useful. So Perloff talks about that, where did the delight and the moving part go in this particular definition. Now, this is something that I just wanted to have another quote from Alex Preston, and that was published in The Guardian in 2015. And Preston writes that since Margaret Thatcher's education reforms in the red-braced 1980s, when performance management was the watchword and humanities suffered from more from the cuts and any other public services. So what happened, and I'm sort of just for time, what happened is Thatcher, and this is the narrative in the UK that I'm because I'm located in the Anglo-American academia right now, so I'm just like making sure that you also know about the kind of the narrative that is about crisis in the humanities, is that from the 1980s onwards there were pressures on what would actually be useful to study. And I'm sure I don't need to actually clarify things, because if the audience is mostly from India, and they would also know that the new education policy and a lot of other policies are about how to make things work. And somehow and I'm not saying that the new education policy in any way marginalizes humanities and language studies, but in the same way that the tendency has been to make sure that things have to work in a way that sciences or the commerces or maybe like businesses work. So this is where precisely where humanities or to study humanities becomes such a huge challenge, because in many cases, what do you do with an English literature graduate degree certificate? Do you go for, if you're sitting for a bank, like an exam in the public sector, like a bank or railways, what did your Milton and your Shakespeare give back to you? So this is the this is the problem. I think if we think about that, humanities is an inculcation of something which brings to me a sense of or a capacity to argue, to critically interpret, to sort of bring about a cultivation of critical thinking within me. And if that is the end of humanities, and that is, I think, what humanities have been doing pretty well, is something to think about. And then probably the question of jobs and utility become a challenge. Now, I'd just like to share another opinion on the humanities, and then just move on from there to the other part of the talk. And these are like 5 or 6 slides together, not many. So this is another article that came out in New Yorker on April 11th, 2020. That is when coronavirus situation was getting worse in the UK and in the US, and written by Agnes Callard. That sort of the piece is titled, "What do the humanities do in a time of crisis?" Now, this is starting. Look at the start of this particular sort of piece. The first few sentences, I'll just read out like a couple of sentences from the beginning. Humanities are cloistered gardens. Sorry, universities are cloistered gardens. The classroom is the innermost sanctum of that cloister, where worldly demands can be blocked out long enough for a group of people, some of whom had no prior interest, to share a poem by Horace or an argument by Aristotle. In the past few weeks, as schools have sent students home, the sanctum has been breached. Moving classes online means replacing the shared, clean space of the classroom with a collection of private and cluttered rooms, etc., etc. Point being, here is again, there is a tendency, and if in the first slide, if we thought that, okay, the humanities are something that are, somewhere in the past, and we need to sort of remind people that humanities means also instruction and delight. The other definition is humanities or universities are cloistered gardens, where it's a very sanctimonious sort of an innermost sanctum of that cloister where we study Aristotle, Horace, etc. So this is another definition that to me misleads. Is it something that we do with the humanities? Do we just read Aristotle and Horace in some sort of a closed space and giving out an idea that we have no clue what's going on outside? Now, to challenge this article or the tone or the sense of this article, I'm not saying to challenge Agnes Callard's understanding of the humanities or in general, but to challenge probably this particular interpretation of humanities. So another scholar, Hannah Alpert Abrams, wrote on the same day, as you can see, April 11th, 2020, a sort of a response piece called "What the Humanities Do in a Crisis." It was published in Medium. Now, she goes on to show that it's not only that is precisely what we do in humanities, just study Aristotle or study or watch sort of TV series and interpret them. We are probably the first people, and the things that we are associated with, universities, museums, art galleries, etc., always bear the first brunt of the funding cuts. So it's not that we suddenly realized, oh, we were studying Aristotle and suddenly we thought that, okay, Aristotle or that particular moment Horace didn't make any sense to the world. That's why they decided to cut our funding. She says that in the same way that other sectors respond, we also respond. We start creating campaigns. We start making the same kind of challenges, that making the same kind of inroads and interventions that other streams, other professions do. So what we do here is that we kind of sort of, we are given the task to think anew in the way that humanities, how does the field, how do people associated with the field, facing the brunt, facing the crisis, respond? And to quote her, what do the humanities do in a time of crisis? we do what every profession does. We mobilize our communities, identify our areas of expertise, and find ways work together for the collective good. We come together to envision a better future, and then we begin the work of making that future real. Something to think about. So this is a kind of understanding of humanities that I'm also inclined to. So here, I just pasted a particular link from KCL, that is King's College London, about some of the projects in arts and humanities that they are doing in response to the COVID crisis. So just to sort of for time, I'll just move on to the next part. So if this is what is our, or let's say my understanding of humanities, then what is the first part of the title making here, or sort of meaning here, sort of catastrophic realities. Again, think about that, about what we do in the humanities, and then we'll come back to that. So catastrophic realities is something that I believe we are going through right now. Catastrophe is again, from Cambridge English Dictionary, it's a sudden event that causes very great trouble or destruction. Catastrophes are always sudden. Astrophe is the star, the falling of the star, and making huge cataclysmic changes, sort of, a flood, earthquake, sort of a nuclear, a sort of a war, etc. These are all catastrophes, things that come suddenly. At the same time, it will be entirely wrong, to me at least, to say that these things have always been sudden, as if we have never anticipated a war, as if we have never anticipated a flood. Now, when I say people can still anticipate wars, what about earthquakes? We didn't anticipate an earthquake. Did we anticipate the coronavirus outbreak? To me, like to people like me who have not been into the sort of niche scientific fields, sort of environmental fields that deal with environmental and global sort of warning systems, we can, from another perspective, from another route, see that, or have come to realize that floods and earthquakes, or even a pandemic of this nature, are not sudden. They are a consequence of a long-term historical and socio-political violence. These forms of violence have led to damage, let's say environmental damage, to such an extent that things that do not appear to our eyes, things that are invisible, things that are slow, things that are moving at a very sort of a sluggish kind of a pace. We don't see those things. Malnutrition, for instance, India's hunger condition has been abysmally bad, and every time there is a report that comes up, Global Hunger Index, we are doing absolutely horrible. And then just the meaning of which is that we as a nation are not able to feed our own population. So this is not something that is sudden, right? This has been happening for a long time. Food crisis is something that I work on, and some of the things that I have come to read, that food crisis was there and could go back to as far back as late 18th century, especially if we read it through a colonial lens. Now, the point here was that catastrophe was not sudden, as if we had no clue and suddenly it appeared to us. And it might be an interpretation, but this is not what humanities studies, or the kind of critical thinking that we have been trained to sort of develop, allow us to do. So I'm taking again another quote from Seth Baum, who is a catastrophe and risk specialist, who wrote a piece on BBC Future. It's called "Why Catastrophes Can Change the Course of Humanity." And note that this piece was written on 9th April 2019. And this is what Baum says, and I quote him: "What the intersection of famine and destruction following a nuclear war tells us is that catastrophes are often interconnected. The consequences and vulnerability a single catastrophe creates can linger for many years after the event. A nuclear war wasn't just a nuclear war. It is also an economic recession and an agricultural failure. How well civilization endures it may depend a lot on how much it has already been weakened by global warming and other environmental degradation. The effects of the nuclear war could precipitate additional catastrophes such as a pandemic, due to weakened public health infrastructure or a catastrophic failure of geoengineering leading to accelerated climate change. The point that I was trying to make here, why I bring this quote, is that again, Sidbaum also makes this thing very clear that catastrophes are connected. They're interconnected. One leads to another. So, for instance, just to give you an example, in India, we saw how the catastrophic conjuncture of the coronavirus led to the migrant crisis. And many of us, it did not have to be in India to sort of witness the crisis, right? And many of us are actually seeing the crisis, witnessing the crisis unfolding mostly over. Many of us who are outside, elsewhere, based elsewhere, over the air, or online, or sort of televisual media. So if catastrophes are connected, then this is the difficult task to me that humanities have to sort of perform, or humanities scholars have to perform, is to go through this catastrophic conjuncture and also to analyze. It's a very difficult task. It demands a lot of emotional investment. So just to bring it back to our current condition, and we are seeing here that there is a talk about the new normal, that coronavirus is going to stay. It is not going to go anywhere else, even after a few months or even years. You never know. We never know, in fact, that this transition to online studying and work, etc., is going to be a norm. We don't know. And this is the new normal that people have been talking about. And the new normal includes global lockdown, funding and job cuts, public health crisis, increasing mental health issues, work from home and zero contracts, etc., etc., and plenty of other things, which interestingly are not something that are characteristic to a particular nation or a particular locality. It's happening everywhere. That's the global nature of the crisis. And what is happening in this particular situation is that we are always at a challenge to cognize things. I mean, like, if I'm working from home and I'm giving this particular webinar right now, and I then get to realize that when I talk to my parents who are based in a remote place in Bengal, in the northern region of Bengal, and which is a small town, and which is like people have begun to sort of panic because the virus has finally sort of encroached, so to say. And if I talk to them and realize that how they're feeling anxious, as I have been as well, and I've been through, then what happens with this kind of cognitive disruption, that things are going normal? I'm giving a talk, I'm doing everything from home, I'm marking, scripting, etc., writing essays, and then I know that at the back of my mind that things are not at all normal, right? And we are just trying to make sure that things are normal, or trying to be normal, because otherwise we can't live, at least as humans. So there is a cognitive disruption going on, and this is precisely the nature of catastrophic reality. The reality is disruptive, and it gives us a challenge to represent that reality. And I'm not going to be going into how to represent reality, the question of aesthetic and representational politics, which the previous speaker, Daniela, already sort of brought into the fold. And I'm sure like throughout this conference, people will be talking about aesthetics. I'm just giving you some of these ideas that have come to me, that and somebody who works in the areas of catastrophe and realism, how people respond, how people, speakers, citizens, subjects respond to such a conjuncture, which is both slow and yet disruptive, yet catastrophic. So I'll go to the final two slides. So this is what I was thinking about in terms of what humanities studies could do, ought to do, or probably are already doing, that we are not being able to sort of comprehend clearly. So these are the four things that have come to my mind as I have been sort of going through this situation of catastrophic conjuncture right now. So these are emotive, narrative, inquisitive, and collective. So the first thing to me is that humanities to me remind us of our humanness, right? Humanities come from humans, humanism, and some of these values have been challenged, of course, for a better end. Maybe something new ideas and new values will come up, but that doesn't always take away the fact that we are humans and we have our limitations. And these emotions are very important. Emotions when we feel that somebody who is very near and dear has been affected by the particular catastrophic situation, or even if not even somebody. Look at like the migrants were not our relatives, right? But we felt so badly about them, about the situation that our decisions have sort of led to. By our decision, it is the government's decision that we are also part and parcel of. So these emotions are not something to kill. And these emotions are very important to remind us that we are doing something that critically deals with the human. And then we also have the articulatory capacities, as I said, the angst that we felt on the migrant crisis. And already I've seen plenty of poems and short forms have come out in support or in sort of critique of the crisis. People like Gulzar, like poets, renowned poets and lyricists like Gulzar, and also, Bollywood sort of film stars and actors like Taapsee Pannu have also written poems, sort of penned different kind of reactions, graphic poem that she has written. So this is the thing that I want us to remember, that this part is very important. This holds us together. Second part, of course, is narrative. And this is where I feel like we need to remember one thing, that even if a catastrophe of this nature, even if a vaccine appears very soon in the next 2-3 months, the disease or the impact of it will not run away. Will not, because it has a very disproportionate impact on us, who we are in terms of gender, race, class, caste, and other social perimeters or social sort of evaluators. It has been very disproportionate, uneven. It's not right to say that all of us are together in this. Of course, all of us are together in this, but all of us have not been impacted by the situation evenly. That's something that I want to remind us of. And that's precisely why the narratives are very important, narratives of different kinds that are coming out. The narratives that people write, even on social media, tiny narratives, just a few responses, like temporary minute responses, or even not being able to say anything. Because when I was working on the famine-related literature in the 40s, and in Bengal famine-related literature and Irish famine-related literature, there is a situation that there is a claim that the famine did not result in a lot of literature. Why then we see some of the stalwarts, literary stalwarts, are not talking about the famine, be it in Ireland, be it in India, etc. It is not simply true. People did write about them. It's not that sometimes they are not preserved well, and sometimes they're preserved in situations or in areas, in locations, in spaces which are not always accessible. So there is bound to be a narrativizing of the catastrophe, and that's very important. And that's something, a project that Professor Catherine Boyle has begun in KCL, King's College London, called World Making in Time of COVID-19. As an example, I was just pointing it out. The third part is inquisitive. This is something, as I said, humanities begins with critical thinking. We are trained to think critically. We are into a particular stream where it continuously reminds us that things that appear there, we need to understand what is beneath or behind it. So catastrophes are interconnected. If they are interconnected, how do we know that? Do we feel like there is anything that, and I was just writing about the vertical, horizontal, and lateral links. The vertical link, the horizontal links. For instance, people say that there's a particular situation in China that led to the outbreak of the virus. Can we just ascribe all the tensions, anxieties, or all the strands of this outbreak to just one single point? Or can we see that this has been already in the fold, as in like this has been there, this anxiety has been there? Can we just ascribe a particular crisis such as the economic recession in the 2008 just because banks suddenly got bankrupt, so to say? So point is, we are trained to think how certain historical, cultural, social, and political reasons lead to the outbreak of an event, so to say, an event of this nature, be it a pandemic or be it an earthquake. These are things that that's as an example, as I was doing, as I'm still doing work on how famines were related with colonialism and imperialism, and not necessarily only with the sort of the immediate reason of food shortage, and how people in different parts and closer or sort of far away, they have registered these links between empire and famine in their writings or in their cultural productions. These are things, cultural productions can give us a gateway, can give us a sort of a path to enter into the discussion of the historical or the sociocultural. So these are things that that is something that humanities remind us, make us inquisitive. And the final part is, of course, collective. If we are dealing with humanities and humanness and sort of something to do with inquisitive, sort of emotive part, it has to reach out to people, right? And one of the challenges of humanities in the last few years or decades that to my understanding has been that humanities have not been able to translate some of these ideas in a language that is accessible to a wider public. And then there is a very typical sort of neoliberal question of a tax-paying citizen. Why should we pay a tax when things that you are doing aren't making any sense to me? So these are things that have been there. We can't deny them, right? The kind of way that we have done humanities in a particular sense has not been accessible to a lot, and that has given a more of a reactionary, conservative sort of response from humanities scholars to even saying that it doesn't have to be accessible to people. Of course, it doesn't have to be accessible to people because it's a fundamental knowledge, and the mathematician or somebody else doesn't have to tell people all the time that what they're doing and how these things are accessible. But I think what makes humanities, and this is precisely, a mathematician doesn't have to also show the emotive nature or the narrative nature throughout. And that's precisely what humanities start with, the reading of human, and those readings need to go to the human as well, to me. So that's precisely where on ground and online kind of work, and what you do, and how those things that we study, the people in a crisis, if we are studying people in a crisis, these things need to be translated to people who are going to, so that they can see the framework, they can also cognize. It's a task of the humanities scholar to also help educate, right, in the kind of a framework that you are also using. So this is precisely what I feel like humanities in a catastrophic time period could do, is to make sure that if we are all into this particular crisis together, then we make sure that the kind of frameworks that we are dealing with, the kind of emotions that we are going through, the narratives that are coming out, are also to some extent, as far as possible, accessible to a wider public who are looking at us, because they also revere us, because they also respect that we're also doing something which is like we're finally fundamentally teachers. We teach language and literature. That's not something that we should take away from ourselves, that we are teachers, that we are educators, that we are scholars, or we are students, let's say the broad term, students of literature. So these are things, I think these are things that we need to remind us again and again whenever there is a crisis, that these are tasks that, and I'm sure these are just the four aspects that I've dealt with. There are plenty other aspects, but these are things that I believe in the time of the crisis right now, these are coming back again and again. So finally, so just to take this kind of inquisitive nature in mind about the humanities studies, I'd like to finish with a thinker, a scholar, and a writer whose work I have been reading with a lot of interest for a long time. I'm sure many of you have been. This is Edward Said, and this is a particular quote I'd like to read out about the role of the intellectuals. This is from Representations of the Intellectual series of lectures that Said gave, and it is 1996. And this is something that I believe, like, we continuously remind us that humanities, if we are trained to do critical thinking, then dissent, intellectual dissent, is part of our life. Is the way that we deal. We are taught to question, right? And that question doesn't need, and in this particular book, Edward Said, it sort of came out as a book. Edward Said says that it's not about the continuous critique of governmental policy. It's a reminder to be alert all the time. And I'm just quoting it, sort of giving you the quote from the introduction, and I'll just conclude after that. To quote him, I do not want to be misunderstood. Intellectuals are not required to be humorless complainers. Nothing less could be true of such celebrated and energetic dissenters as Noam Chomsky or Gore Vidal. Witnessing a sorry state of affairs when one is not in power is by no means a monotonous, monochromatic activity. It involves what Foucault once called a relentless erudition, scouring alternative sources, exhuming buried documents, reviving forgotten or abandoned histories. It involves a sense of the dramatic and of the insurgent, making a great deal of one's rare opportunities to speak, catching the audience's attention, being better at wit and debate than one's opponents. And there is something fundamentally unsettling about intellectuals who have neither offices to protect nor territory to consolidate and guard. Self-irony is therefore more frequent than pomposity, directness more than hemming and hawing. But there is no dodging the inescapable reality that such representations by intellectuals will neither make them friends in high places nor win them official honors. It is a lonely condition, yes, but it is always a better one than a gregarious tolerance for the ways things are. Unquote. So just to remind us with that if we are teachers and if we are students, and if critical thinking is part and parcel of the way that we do if inquisitiveness, narrativity, emotiveness, the study, the patience that study demands, or humanity study demands, if these are part and parcel, then they will sort of, ask us to not only see what is happening around right now in the coronavirus crisis, but also to make sense of what is happening. And that's a very challenging task. And if an intellectual's task is, as Said says, is to make sure that it's a task where we will not be a people pleaser. We will not be somebody who will continue to say nice things, about not so nice events. Then this is what you have chosen as a profession, and it is not something that we as humanities scholars could give up on or could sort of sacrifice. And this is where I would like to end the talk. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Sourit. I'm just summarizing one question that one of our colleagues asked, and I had also a lot of things to comment or discuss, but I have to skip everything here at this point. Just to summarize what Sourit Bhattacharya from our department is asking, and which I'm also adding, that don't you think that critical thinking, and just like this is something which many scholars have also talked about, a training in critical thinking, which is a disciplinary training also, that the ability to question disciplines, go beyond disciplines, interdisciplinarity also calls for a training. So in that part, there is a structural requirement always, that there is a structural. By structural, I mean that there is a tendency to bring this kind of training within a structure to somewhere to limit it. Don't you think and that there are this kind of attempts that is also happening now also and will happen because of the COVID situation in terms of the structuring of the idea of humanities as it is? You talked about crisis already, different, and I was also talking about crisis at the beginning, that in different junctures, different types of crises have come, and that is how the idea of humanities has been emphasized. So in that way, in that different crisis and the structuring going on always, a similar kind of a phase we are also going through. So yeah, don't you feel that?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Subro, for the question. If I've got it correctly, is that there is always a tendency to structuring critical thinking, right? To bring it within a fold, a particular fold. You see, that's a thing that is probably part of disciplinary teaching all the time, that you need to know the tools of the discipline to challenge the tools, and or the way that the paradigms have been set. That Stephen Kuhn would have said that a particular kind of a paradigm, things that are not possible from within a paradigm might lead to the possibility of another paradigm in a different paradigm altogether. So to come back to the point is that I believe that the discussions, at least for students of literature, for teachers, for scholars of literature, should start from that they know what is part or entails within the paradigm, so that they can start asking questions which are not being thought about from within the paradigm at that particular point of time. So, for instance, if we are talking about the coronavirus, that's the challenge that I'm sure like many of us are dealing with as a humanities scholar, is that you are going through the situation, right, in different ways, in multilateral ways, and then you'll have to also make sense of the situation, because that is precisely what you were trained to do, to analyze situations, to sort of critically interpret situations. You can't help ignore that, and that's the deal that we have sort of signed up when we have decided to do humanities in higher studies. That okay, and it might come across as in the conferences and webinars and talks might come across too much at this point of time. Even like writing poetry, somebody said that poets are not, there is not enough literary works right now because it will take some time. Of course it will take some time, we need to breathe in between, but at the same time, if we are supposed to work from home as humanities scholars and take part in intellectual conversations, then we continue to have to be also self-aware of the fact that these are also part and parcel of the structure that have signed up for, right? Like conferences, seminars, and then writing, publishing papers. But that's the irony, and that's precisely, I feel like, to some extent, Edward Said was talking about self-irony becomes more important than pomposity. And if somebody is critically self-aware, and I think that's precisely where things can start. So of course, like the structuring of the thought or the tools will be there, but at the same time, maybe as scholars, we'll have to also remember that these are things we have subscribed, and at the same time not as sort of unthinking obeyers or unthinking subservient sort of followers, but also things that we continuously have to challenge and question. And these are things that make us human to some extent to study humanities.
Thank you, Professor Sourit Bhattacharya, for
Thank you so
your
much.
wonderful wonderful talk. And unfortunately, we cannot discuss continue the discussion. We have to end it and move on to the next speaker.